Amen. So our reading today is from Matthew. Obviously, we're carrying on through the theme. So we're going to read Matthew 23 from 1 to 12. Okay. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to the disciples, "The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must obey them and do everything they tell you. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy loads and put them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do is for men to see. They make their paralytics and their tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor and the banquets, and most important, seats in the synagogue. They love to be greeted in the marketplaces and to have men call them rabbi. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you only have one master, and you are all brothers. And do not call anyone on the earth Father, for you have one Father, and he is in heaven. Nor are you called teacher, for you have one teacher, the Christ. The greatest among you will be your servant, for whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted."
Good morning. It's nice to be with you, and know a few faces, but most of you I don't know, so it's really nice to meet lots of you for the first time, and I'm here with my family. Grew up on the other side of the river, on the Wirral, but not lived around these parts for a long time. These days we live in Derby, and up for the day, and visiting family while we're here. Mum and Dad's still over the other side, and one of my daughters is in Liverpool as well. So it is going to be good to look into the Bible together with you, if you have your Bibles open, at Matthew chapter 23, as we've just read, because we're going to be thinking this morning about integrity, and in particular, integrity in leadership. The unfolding story of Jesus, as you've gone through the book of Matthew, as you've been working through it, it's one of many tensions and contrasts, isn't it? Not least because, as the journey of the gospel goes on, it becomes increasingly apparent that Jesus has a huge amount of power and authority. It's apparent through the things that he does, through the teachings that he brings, and through his character as well. He has a power and an authority like they have never seen before. And all of this is while he hasn't got any kind of official role. He's not got any official title. He's just a carpenter from a backwater northern town that people like to look down their noses at. He's a no one. So when he crosses paths with those who are the authorities of the day and who do have the official power, it creates some of the really quite extraordinary standoffs. And this that we're reading here today and looking at is the latest one. Over the weeks, you've seen a number of them. You will have seen how Jesus has locked horns with the Pharisees and the scribes, these teachers of the law. And as he has become more and more popular, and the Jesus movement is kind of gathering momentum, this has led to them getting really envious, and ultimately to a point where they've said, we have got to get rid of this guy. We have got to get shut of him. And so they have been planning to do that. And so through the previous chapter, through chapter 22, they've tried to be clever. They've been trying to catch him out, trying to make him look stupid, make him look like he's anti-Rome, anti-Caesar, anti the political powers, or anti-Moses on the other side, trying to do things to turn different groups of people against him. But time and time again, he absorbs the heat, he sidesteps the traps, and he stumps them with his wise answers. All leading to what we have at the end of chapter 22, the previous chapter there, where he turns the tables on them and asks them a question they can't answer, such that they now dare not ask him any more questions. And so in chapter 23 here, it's almost as if Jesus says, okay, time up, going to call the whole thing to order. Here is the verdict. They think they've been testing Jesus, but what Jesus shows here is that whatever positions they may hold, whatever human authority they may have, however they may think of him, he is in fact the one who is in charge. He's the one in authority and delivers the verdict on his accusers. And as he does so, he speaks about two things, two big issues: integrity and humility. And these are two things that they lack. And they are the two issues that are woven through this passage. And we're going to talk about each of them in turn. First of all, to talk about integrity. Have I got this right? There we go. Integrity. The call is to be real, not fake. If you look at verses 1 to 3, he says to the crowds, the scribes and Pharisees sit on Moses' seat, so do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do, for they preach but do not practice. Across the land of Israel, there were many towns. And in each town, there was a synagogue. And in each synagogue, there was a chair, a particular seat, which was known as the seat of Moses. And the spiritual leaders, the senior leaders of that synagogue, would sit in that chair to teach the gathered congregation. And the reason for doing this was that it was a kind of symbolic way of showing and describing the way that they took something of the authority of Moses. Moses is the lawgiver. He's the hero of the Old Testament for most of them. He's the key leader. And they, in some measure, have a sense of his authority handed down to them. And Jesus seems to be kind of affirming that this is legit. Some might argue that he's trying to be actually a little sarcastic and saying, of course you should listen to the Pharisees. That's possible, but I think on balance it's more likely that he's saying, these leaders of yours, yes, they have authority and responsibility in as far as they truly teach what Moses taught. You should listen to them. But he calls out a huge problem, which effectively undermines everything they stand for. And it's this: they preach, but do not practice. They don't practice what they preach. And it's a well-known expression in our own society, isn't it? Even in times of, like this, where there's an election coming up, we talk about it with politicians, don't we? He doesn't practice what he preaches. It becomes a scandal, doesn't it, when there's a disconnect between what people say and what they actually do themselves. And Jesus is calling the spiritual bigwigs of his day, he's calling them out as those who lack integrity and authenticity. And there's a couple of ways in which it's seen here. One of the ways it's seen is in how little they care for those that they are responsible for. Look at verse 4. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. The Pharisees in particular had developed long lists and complex interpretations of Old Testament laws, which became crushing burdens in people's lives as they insisted that people live this way, do that, go here, not at that time, do it in this way. And you have to keep all of these things in order to be accepted by God. And it became a huge burden. One of my jobs is that I work with an organization called Radstock, which is a mission network. And I travel to different countries. And it's interesting to see how often religion does function in this way and brings a huge burden on people. I've been in Hindu countries, Buddhist countries, Muslim countries. It looks a little different in each place, but it is invariably a burden. There are rituals, there are requirements, there are long lists of things you must do to keep the god or gods happy. As I said, we live in Derby, we live in the inner city part, and we're in part of a community project called Urban Life. And our area is mostly Muslim, and we have made many friends, dear friends, in the community who are part of the Islamic faith. And we spend a lot of time together. And as part of those friendships, we often have open conversations about life and faith. And I am often struck, again and again, what heavy burdens are on people. Detailed, complex rules, hoping to please God, hoping that he might possibly accept you. The Jewish leaders of the time loved this kind of thing. They'd really majored on this approach, and so they'd been right through the Old Testament, and worked out that there were 248 commands and 365 prohibitions. So I guess it could be one for every day of the year, couldn't it? You publish a little calendar, rip off the page every morning at breakfast with a prohibition of the day. That would be a nice way to start the day, wouldn't it? But while the Old Testament law may have been detailed, these guys didn't leave it there. They unpacked it a bit more. So that what we do know is that around this time and over the next couple of centuries, the Jewish leaders codified all of this into something called the Mishnah, which was 800 pages long in the English translation of it. And then they wrote the Talmud on top of that to try and comment on the Mishnah to explain that, which ran to 20 volumes. The level of detail was astonishing. So, for example, they defined what you were allowed to carry on the Sabbath, what counted as work. Here's how they defined it. You can carry food equal in weight to a dried fig. You can carry wine enough for mixing in a goblet, milk enough for one swallow, honey enough to put on one wound, water enough to moisten an eye salve, paper enough to write a customs house notice on, and ink enough to write 2 letters of the alphabet. No more, just 2. They excelled at all kinds of detailed rules, going way beyond what the scriptures required, creating heavy, heavy burdens which made people's lives unbearable. And they didn't care that their lives were breaking under the weight. And part of the indictment was this: they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. They won't even lift one finger to help. Such a contrast, isn't it, with the way that Jesus is described. If you remember earlier in Matthew, in chapter 12, where it's quoting Isaiah 42 and speaking of the servant who would come as the one who will not break a bruised reed and who won't snuff out a smouldering wick. And the image is of 2 apparently insignificant, broken, worn-out things that most people would think nothing of. And yet it says the Messiah would treat those items with a special kind of care and gentleness. A metaphor for how he would treat his people, and does treat his people. Remember Jesus telling his followers that his burden is light, to come and rest. Jesus handles us with great care and compassion in our struggles, in our woundedness and our weakness, in our efforts to do what is right, in our failures to do what is right. In our life's journey, he is there for us. And so whereas the Pharisees thought the broken and the downcast were just getting what they deserved, Jesus always made a point of moving towards those kind of people. They were the ones Jesus went for. And they still are. He picks up the broken and the weak and the discarded. He is there for us. He is there for you today. Many people think that leadership is about throwing your weight around and piling the pressure on everybody else, making sure people know who's boss and just turning the screw a little bit. But it's not. If you don't love people, you shouldn't be in leadership. The most important of the commandments was what? It was mentioned in the previous chapter. To love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Love for others is basic. Leadership is about others, actually. It's about serving for the benefit of others. It's not something that's all about you. Which is how the failure of integrity next showed itself. Because we've seen how little they cared for others, but we can also see the lack of integrity in how much they are concerned about their own self-image. If you look at verse 5, it says, they do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. They want the spotlight. They want to be seen. They want their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. Sounds bizarre, doesn't it? Sounds like a strange combination of a medical condition and a hairstyle, doesn't it, really? My phylacteries are getting a bit broad. Oh, we can go and see the doctor and get something for that, And a fringe, is it talking about hair fashions or what is it? Well, phylacteries were little boxes which were made to hold verses from the Old Testament. And it was taking literally the idea that you get in various places in the Old Testament, in Exodus 13 and Deuteronomy 6 and others, that you should bind the words to your head and your hand. And it was meant to be, it was a metaphor of how everything we think and do should be shaped by God, by his words. It should govern our thinking and our actions. But somewhere along the way, it seems maybe 1,000 years or so after the law was actually given, someone decided to make it a literal thing. And these little leather boxes were made, and they would be attached somehow to the arm. And there'd be some kind of strap. And the thing was, after a while, it became a bit of a badge of honor. And it became a bit of a way of bragging and a competition, like children. My phylactery is bigger than your phylactery. I have more Bible verses in mine. You only got space for 3 in yours. Oh, poor you. And the fringe, well, other translations have tassel, and it was from Numbers 15. And again, this was something that the Old Testament said they should do. Tassels on the corner of your garments, it marked you out. It was a kind of a membership badge. But then that got distorted so that it became, instead of just being a marker, being one of God's people, it became a way of showing off. I'm really one of God's people. Look at the size of my tassels. They became bigger and thicker and longer. It wasn't something that they were doing for God anymore. It wasn't about loving or living for him. It was for others to see, cultivating a profile, cultivating an image. And all this is really then getting into the second main point, because the second thing they lacked integrity, but they also lacked humility. So the call there is be humble, not self-centered. Look at verse 6 and 7. They love the place of honor at feasts, the best seats in the synagogues, and greetings in the marketplaces, and being called rabbi by others. When they arrive at the feast, they want to be seen. They want to come in the main entrance. They want to be noticed and have the big welcome. They want the best seat in the synagogue. They want people to come up to them and greet them with lots of titles, rabbi and so on. That's what they really want. But Jesus basically says, who do you think you are? I mean, literally, really, who do you think you are? If you look at verse 8 and 9 and 10, he says, you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Christ. Now, what does this mean? Does this mean that you never address anyone with respect or with some kind of title? I mean, that can't be right, can it? This has to be a form of hyperbole. It frankly would be a very weird message on Father's Day for me to say, call no one on earth Father. Right? That's our text for today. Call no one Father. So I go to my parents after this and I walk in and I say, hi, Mum, and Henry. Like, it doesn't mean that, does it? And same for the other categories too. I don't advise, if you're in school or college or university, that when someone comes in tomorrow and says that they're your teacher for the next lesson, that you go, no. I have no teachers, no instructors, only. That's not going to fly, is it? What does it mean? Jesus is trying to puncture their inflated, arrogant egos of men who think they are better than everybody else and are looking down from some kind of superior plane of existence. You're prancing around in your fancy clothes with your ever-growing phylacteries and your huge tassels. You're almost tripping over them. You're making everybody's lives unbearable. Who do you think you are? And he does genuinely want them to think that, because verse 9, what he says is, you're all brothers. You're brothers and sisters together. And you're all children of the Heavenly Father. So stop it with the superiority complex. Here's what you need to understand, says Jesus. In verse 11 and 12, the greatest among you shall be your servant. Almost certainly referring to himself. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Be humble, not self-centered. Be real, not fake, and be humble, not self-centered. Now, what are we to make of all of this for today? Well, how do we draw it together? We need to take it seriously, don't we? Because it's easy sometimes to look at these kind of accounts and roll our eyes and laugh at the Pharisees as kind of pantomime villains. He's behind you. And that's not the idea. Let's not kid ourselves that A, this is not serious, B, it doesn't happen today, and C, it doesn't happen to us. Because it is, it does, and it can. We need to apply this. And so we'll do it in three ways as we pull it together. We're going to think, first of all, what it shows us about Jesus, and then about leadership today, and then what it says to all of us, whether we're in leadership roles or not. So what it shows us about Jesus. We already thought about how Jesus' way of handling people was in stark contrast to the leaders he was criticizing. That he's caring and kind to those of us who are broken and messed up. Unlike the leaders of the day, he acted with integrity, didn't he? He did practice what he preached, and he lived with humility. So, verse 11, as we said, the greatest among you shall be your servant. Talking about himself, he's already said to them, you have one leader, one instructor, Christ himself, and yet he is among them as one who serves. And that is an amazing thing to comprehend, isn't it? That the only one, who had every right to pull rank and parade around as the greatest human being of all time, came humbly as one who serves. And in the coming weeks, as you continue through Matthew's gospel, it'll be clear, won't it, and see how it's worked out in his ultimate sacrifice on the cross. Philippians 2 echoes it as well, doesn't it? Maybe you can read it later if you want. We're not going to turn there now, but that great poem that speaks of Jesus who had every right to hang on to his status with the Father, and yet he came down and became one of us and suffered and died, serving us in order to make the universe whole again, including us, to put us back together, to forgive us and free us. By contrast with the Pharisees, Jesus' way is freeing and it is light. I mean, it's a challenge. It's a huge challenge because it's a call to give up your life and to completely reorient yourself. And yet, it's the path to freedom and joy. He cares for you and he loves you. He wants to take away the crushing burden of always trying to be enough. Trying to be accepted by a religion or secular society, for that matter, and set you truly free so that you can flourish as he made you to. That's what this says about Jesus. Jesus is our loving rabbi. He's our ultimate leader and teacher. But we also need to apply this to leadership today, don't we? Because there are many issues with bad leadership, and it's no wonder that in verse 13, which is sneaking into the next section, Jesus calls the leaders hypocrites. And literally, as I'm sure lots of you know, hypocrite was the Greek word of the time. It just meant actor. That's what they called actors. It was what it meant. They were the people on the stage performing for the crowds. And when you think about it, that's what actors do, isn't it? If you're an actor, your job is to pretend to be someone you're not. That's your job description. And some people are really good at it, aren't they? Method actors especially, they get really into it and start to imagine that they really are this person, embrace the personality and the manner, all of that, but it's not real. It's not them. In those days, of course, it was done with a mask. You kind of held up a mask and you had different ones you could use at different parts of the story, but you hid your true face. And all of that is fine if you're on the stage, but it's deadly in real life, in situations, interpersonal relationships, community life, and especially in leadership roles. Projecting an image that is not you. Now, Jesus, in the rest of the chapter, is going to give a whole series of specific ways in which they do that. But poor leadership, or worse, false and dangerous leadership, looks like this. It has these traits. And if you're a leader in some role or other, you need to ask yourself hard questions. We have to ask, am I being real? Do I care for the people I'm leading? Am I enabling and equipping them to know God and live for him? Or am I doing this for my own name and fame? And making it difficult for the people I lead, subduing them. There is a kind of Christian faith which, like the Pharisees, becomes very legalistic and rule-based and weighs people down and squashes them under the weight of expectations. And at its worst, turns the basis of our relationship with God to little more than rules, which poisons our understanding of grace and acceptance with God. You end up with a leadership that's not concerned for the people being led so much as for the leaders themselves, for their own ends. Part of what we do in our area where we live is do some ESOL classes, English classes, working with asylum seekers and refugees. And one of my Iranian friends a little while ago was saying to me, and also another Pakistani friend, were talking about how in their countries, political power, or leadership in general, is largely self-serving. Political power is a way to get rich, he said. That's what it is. You never leave office poor. Well, unless you leave office in prison. But it's a way to get rich. It's about serving yourself, getting your own way. That's almost the point of being a leader, so you can tell people what to do. Putting yourself first and lording it over others. Not so with you, Jesus said. True leadership is not about you, it's about serving, and therefore requires humility. So this just shaped the kind of leader you are, if you are one, and many of you here will be leaders in some way or other. Be real. Be humble. But finally, let's just think about what this says to all of us. Because one thing that this does for us is to help us to know what we look for in leaders. Leaders should be an example to follow. That's why it's so damaging when leaders fall and turn out to be fake. Remember how Paul wrote that people should follow him as he followed Christ. Leaders are to be an example. It's not enough to tick doctrinal statements or have a qualification or be a good preacher if you don't practice what you preach, if you don't live it. That's why James says, let not many of you presume to be teachers. It's a fearful thing to stand before God and turn out to have been a charlatan, to be a fraud. So part of it is know what you're looking for, but does that mean perfection? Of course, no one is perfect apart from Jesus. That's why we only ever say, follow me, to the extent that I follow Christ. And therefore, no leader has any right to expect unquestioning loyalty, do they? And when you find that, run. Call it out, because that's abusive straight off. But at the same time, know that your leaders are not perfect, because they're only one of you, aren't they? We're all brothers and sisters together. We're children in the family of God. We are not the Messiah. And here's why that's okay. Because when leaders handle their own weaknesses and failings well, that actually becomes part of the modeling you look for and expect. How they handle the fact that they're not perfect. How they repent, apologize, humble themselves, and grow and change. Ironically, if you expect perfection from your leaders, you'll leave them no option to be hypocrites, because none of them are perfect. They are fellow disciples. And actually, that's why the call to integrity and humility is for all of us. Because yes, this is about the nature of leadership, but by extension, it's about the nature of true discipleship. When you look at the pastoral letters in the New Testament, you read the qualifications of those who lead, it's not primarily a list of skills. The ability to teach is there for elders, but the rest of it is all about what kind of person you should be, because leaders ultimately lead by modeling what living for Jesus looks like. Older brothers and sisters who model it and help us, therefore, to do what they're already doing. They're just a bit further down the track than we are. I was in Cambodia a few years ago, and I met a church leader who'd been a Christian just for a few months. And I said, a few months? Really? And then you got the backstory. He was the first Christian in his village. So he would take the lead, wouldn't he? He was the one who'd been a Christian longer than anybody else. Having integrity and humility is therefore something we all need. The call is to be real and to be humble. So as we finish, has anybody got this nailed here? I doubt it. I don't know most of you, but I'm not being rude, but I doubt it. We've all got our issues and hang-ups and fail sometimes, but we grow together and we walk this path together as brothers with our Father, following Christ with some of our brothers and sisters just a little further along. We're not the finished article yet, are we? And we need patience with one another as we grow. Just to finish, let me just tell you one little last encouragement. I love this story about Ruth Bell Graham, Billy Graham's wife. She was a legend. She died in 2007. I discovered recently that on her gravestone she has these words: "End of construction. Thank you for your patience." Isn't that great? God's at work in all of us. So let's do this together as followers of Jesus. Whether we have a leadership role or not, let's grow in integrity and humility like the Jesus we love and follow. Let's pray. Father, you are